Thank you, Mr. Chair. Paul Butler, Durham 4. There are around 60 million people forcibly displaced in the world. They become refugees through persecution, violence, and war. In Burundi, over 200,000 have fled the country, and tens of thousands are internally displaced since the violence that began in April. The story goes unreported here because they will not arrive in Europe. But 8 million internally displaced in Syria and 4 million who have fled into Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, then some onto Europe, that directly affects us. So too those fleeing Afghanistan, Iraq, Eritrea and southern Sudan. 800,000 have arrived in Europe this year. Around 3,200 have died trying to reach Europe. The numbers are approximate, but God knows exactly how many there are. God knows every one of them by name. He counts every hair on the head. Each one made in God's image and someone for whom Jesus Christ died. It seems an age since the picture of the body of a 3-year-old boy washed up on a Turkish shore marked a decisive shift in the public mood. Then the horror of 129 people killed in Paris in one night, and perhaps another shift in the public mood. We have wept and prayed over these deaths. Cruel, murderous violence is terrible, whether on our doorstep or far distant. Whether the ensuing death and suffering is witnessed in the streets of Paris or on the shores of Turkey, Lesbos or Lampedusa. All of this suffering is the cry of my neighbour. And in so many cases, our neighbours have had to flee their home. There is a deep need for a generous and constructive discourse which develops a new understanding of the reality of global migration. Great regional migrations have marked past centuries. Perhaps global migration is to be one of the marks of this century. Groups of Christians are meeting to work towards such a language, not least across the continent of Europe. Our chief purpose in this debate, however, is less broad and ambitious. It is to talk about how we as God's people respond to the practical opportunities which God gives us. The British government has taken impressive lead in aid to the region, in which the vast majority of those suffering from displacement are still trying to survive. If this lead were followed by many other countries, the challenge would become less daunting. There would be more hope of people believing they can make a life within the region. Bitter winter conditions are now beginning to descend on those without homes. It was also welcome when the Prime Minister made a commitment to receive 20,000 Syrians whose risks and needs are most acute for resettlement in the UK. Most of us have seen this number as a good start. The Archbishop of Canterbury welcomed it, but as a slim response. 84 bishops wrote to the Prime Minister urging that we take more. It is hard to imagine a list of British values which did not contain the word hospitality. It stands close to the heart of the gospel. So many waves of people needing protection and help over centuries and in living memory. Ugandan Asians, Vietnamese, Bosnians, Kosovans. Each time what began as a costly commitment by our country has ended as a creative enrichment of it. Hospitality does not involve an idealizing of the guest. Guests can be hard to understand, damaged, vulnerable, unfamiliar. But through their coming, healing can enter the house. Many in the churches believe that if we put our backs into working with others to create the capacity, we can make 20,000 a number that can be comfortably exceeded. After all, it's not money that will do most to enable people driven from Syria to make new lives. It is practical care from a community inviting them in, suggesting in many practical ways the possibility of hope and the promise of safety. When the College of Bishops met recently, it was exciting to hear how many dioceses were already building the local partnerships which ensure that solid, sustained support will be in place for those who are brought to our country, without disadvantaging those many others in need, including others seeking asylum, who are already being sacrificially helped. The government has helpfully announced a forthcoming private sponsorship scheme based on similar schemes in Canada and elsewhere. This is very promising, but it must be implemented as supplementary to the 20,000-person resettlement operation which the government has pledged to arrange and fund. The first 1,000 from Syria are arriving by Christmas. This phase is a stepping up of the Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme, which began early in 2014. The next phase is going to be a much bigger proposition. A government team is working hard to scale up the operation. The churches have been directly involved in this. I've taken on the role of co-chair of the National Refugee Welcome Board, which brings together many branches of civil society, including all the main faiths. I'm working closely with the Bishop of Croydon, who is chair of the Church's Refugee Network. Meetings have taken place with the government ministers responsible for this area of work, another one tomorrow, and with officials who are responsible for detailed implementation. In this, we work closely with churches together in Britain and Ireland. Under the resettlement programme, the UNHCR identifies those who are in most need of resettlement. This is what other countries are doing. It is right and fair. We need to be assured that it is fair to all, including Christians. We have no wish to accelerate an exodus of Christians from any part of the Middle East. We pray for the name of Jesus Christ to be uplifted in every land, not least those where the Church has maintained its witness and developed its distinct local identity over long centuries. And yet there are Christian people who cannot be safe or flourish in any part of the Middle East which they can reach. There is a bond of mutual responsibility and love between Christian people the world over. Now we know from our Lord the way to do justice and love mercy, seeing the image of God in every person. The compassion which compels us to help the refugee will be blind to differences of creed as to colour or any other characteristic. For all that, it is right that we uphold the right of our fellow Christians to fair treatment. Whether or not they are in refugee camps, easy or hard to find, they must suffer no discrimination as UNHCR seeks out those in greatest need of resettlement. Those whose suffering is exacerbated by religiously motivated persecution deserve to have that factor given full weight in the calculation of need. In Durham this month, we welcomed 12 Lutheran clergy from the Nordkirche, northern Germany. We shared Remembrance Sunday. We learned that some of those parishes are engaged in impressive work welcoming some of the refugees arriving in their areas. 1 million have come to Germany. The churches have little support in this and are very stretched. So some of our parishes are now praying about how they can support the work in Germany. Our country is bound together with Europe in so many ways. We will do well to rediscover our common life with the churches of Europe. The dioceses in Europe, supported by US, have been doing terrific work with partner churches on the front line in receiving refugees arriving in boats and by land. These refugees, whether in Calais or elsewhere in Europe, still demand our care. We shall not sleep easy if we pass by, as it were, on our side of the English Channel and regard the fate of those in Europe as separate from our own. The request for safe and legal routes to places of safety, not excluding the possibility that some of those now in Europe might come to Britain, is therefore the final element in the motion which is before Synod. I look forward to our debate because I'm sure we shall hear something of the eagerness and practical commitment with which dioceses and churches across the country are mobilizing to meet these opportunities, responding to these terrible hurts and needs. I almost apologize for the length of the motion, almost but not quite. For this is no simple challenge which we face. It is a challenge full of tears and hope, in which, as my Lutheran sisters and brothers might say, we are utterly thrown upon the grace of God. I beg to move the motion standing in my name.
Well, this matter is now open for debate, and I call, and there's a 5-minute speech limit, first of all Caroline Spellman, followed by Bishop Angelos.
Thank you. Caroline Spellman, 458, Second Church Estates Commissioner. As a new Church Commissioner, I want to help the Church play its role in meeting the challenges of this wave of migration coming to Europe. The Bible teaches us to make the needy stranger welcome in our midst. For one day, Jesus may challenge us with the question, "When I came to you as a migrant, what did you do?" This no doubt inspired the letter signed by 84 bishops to the government asking to do more. Today, I want to explore what it is that we can do together. But first, some context. Britain is a signatory of the Geneva and Hague Conventions, which place an absolute moral imperative on us to help. Indeed, since the outbreak of the war in Syria in 2011, we've already granted asylum or other forms of leave to remain to almost 5,000 Syrians. And the Prime Minister announced our intention to expand this programme by taking some of the most vulnerable displaced Syrians, by working with UNHCR to identify the refugees in situ and, as far as possible, discourage the perilous journey across the Mediterranean at the mercy of the weather and the traffickers. We have the resources to do this because we are committed to spending 0.7% of our gross national income on aid, despite the pressures to save money and spend elsewhere. This means that £1.1 billion is being spent on refugees in situ, including 18 million food rations and giving 1.6 million people access to clean water. The minister responsible for the Syrian refugees, Richard Harrington, has made it clear in replying to the bishop's letter that he wants to involve the Church in the design and implementation of the resettlement plan. He's keen to hear from us what we can do. The Christian charity Home for Good has received 8,000 offers of a home for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. But many of the migrants are coming as families, so a spare room won't be suitable for them. However, all of these offers will need to be registered, and of course, all the families will have to be vetted in the interests of safeguarding. There are already some examples of practical help. The community church in Derby provides a welcome box for migrants and has already helped 129 Syrians settle into its city. An ecumenical group, including members from my own parish church in Knowle in the Birmingham diocese, run a drop-in centre next to the office where migrants have to sign on each week in the West Midlands. I'm sure these models can be replicated, as there will be much more to do as the increased numbers arrive. For example, offers of help to teach English would be very much appreciated. And as Richard Harrington said, offers from Christian landlords to provide secure tenancy. We can also advocate for our brothers and sisters in Christ. The Archbishop of Canterbury has already raised the issue of Christians in Syria, and in a letter to me from the DFID minister, Desmond Swain, he confirmed that while 12% of Syria's population was Christian, no more than 2% of them have registered with UNHCR, which means that Christians either not been willing or unable to do so. We should also advocate for other religious minorities, as the plight of the Yazidis reminded us. But let us address the difficult question of the response of our settled population to incomers. As a student of population geography, I acknowledge the fact that migration can cause fear and resentment. It's a fact that migrants often do outperform the indigenous population, and in so doing, of course, make a very positive contribution to their host country. Our strength as a nation is in part due to assimilating wave after wave of migration. My own ancestors were Huguenots, just one example. But this current wave is mixed with the risk and fear of terrorism, which makes it especially difficult. there is often a blurring of the distinction between economic and humanitarian migration, and of course both types are found in the camps. The government has to be careful to identify genuine refugees. It has to make difficult policy decisions that go much deeper than public opinion. The understandable emotional reaction to the death of that poor Syrian child on a beach in Greece, contrasted with the reaction against the refugees after the Paris attacks, and exemplifies the volatility of the public and media reaction. I have had letters from constituents saying, no more migrants. So to each and every one of us, I ask that we extend the hand of friendship, show our solidarity to those already here and those who come to seek safe haven, as the Holy Spirit requires of us.
After Bishop Angelos, who's speaking for 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes, Mr. Tim Hind for 3 minutes, and all the other speeches will be 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Bishop Angelos, Ecumenical Representative 473. The world is now becoming more aware of something that has been unfolding for years and yet left untreated. But in that context, I'm thankful to this chamber, to the Church of England, to the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, to the Bishop of Durham, the Bishop of Croydon, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, Her Majesty's government in the Prime Minister, the newly appointed Minister for Vulnerable Syrian Refugees, and for the ministers in the Foreign Commonwealth Office, Baroness Annally and Tobias Elwood, because much is being done. From my own experience over the past year, I have been able to visit both Erbil and the Greek-Macedonian border and see the camps there. In their own words, I have seen people who have been on what they call death boats, who, in their own words, have become used to quick deaths by bombs and bullets, but are now dying slow deaths in this journey, and who were carrying what is similar to a Tesco shopping bag that carried everything they possessed. So these people are vulnerable to traffickers, to smugglers, and to everything that meets them. In the past months, we have made submissions to a special select committee on the Syrian refugees. I have met personally with Minister Harrington as well as the Foreign Office ministers to make submissions and see how we can help in sponsoring or in any other way. I'm thankful to the Archbishop of Canterbury for being outspoken, and we are reminded by him yesterday that loving one another and working together is by no means a choice we are free to make or not make, but in his words, this is an obligation. We are also reminded by Her Majesty the Queen that we are ambassadors for Christ and entrusted with a ministry of reconciliation, spreading God's word, peacemaking and conflict resolution. We are a united body of Christ. There is no Church of the East and Church of the West. It is one body and it suffers equally. And so we, I think, need to approach this collaboratively. These are, after all, vulnerable people, and they are not just statistics. But we are also extending this hospitality to non-Christians, because as Christians there is no way we can just look after our own. But this does present a wonderful opportunity, because there is no greater place for light than in the most strict darkness. And so we are here as that light and as that hope. And as the Archbishop of York reminded us yesterday, that this is a golden opportunity to demonstrate to the world that at times of crisis, it is not only possible, but achievable to respond in a way that shows generosity, compassion, and self-sacrifice. We are not here to worry, we are not here to fear, but we are here to present what we can do together, how we can collaborate, how we can work together, and in the spirit of what St. Francis has told us, to work and be the living scripture that is before all. Collaboration is important, and that's, on this point, I would welcome today's motion, and I'm very thankful for the work that's been done on it. We need to collaborate ecumenically. And I want to reassure everyone here that this is not a problem that is a problem to be addressed by the Church of England, but by the Church in England. And I think we all are willing and wanting to work together. Tell us what we can do as well, with our networks, both here in the United Kingdom and in the Middle East. Tell us how we can help and extend that word. In an interreligious way, met with Muslim friends here yesterday at Synod, and we need to support them when they speak confidently and robustly, because they themselves become a target. We need to try to support Christians being where they are and where they belong. Finally, I am thankful for my presence here ecumenically, and I see myself as a voice in and a voice out. As a voice in, I bring you the voices of leaders of the Middle East churches both here and across the Middle East who value your support and want it. And as a voice out, I will go back to them and present the sentiments that I have felt personally in this chamber, that we, our brothers and sisters here, want to support them in every way. And in the words of Revelations 1, we do indeed share with you in Jesus, the persecution, and the kingdom, and in your patient endurance. Thank you.
After Mr. Hind, the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Tim Hind, 247 Bath and Wells. Chair, this is a very timely debate, and to help solve the current issues, I think we need to look to the past and our success or otherwise in dealing with previous issues. One of the hidden jewels of our current response to isolation and lack of social cohesion in multi-faith and multi-ethnic communities is the charity Near Neighbours, and I declare an interest as the Archbishop Council's representative, trustee on that body, but I speak in a personal capacity. Over the last 5 years, Near Neighbours has given 1,000+ grants in 2 tranches to small projects which enable multi-ethnic communities to work together. This has been done in a way which has been without intent to deal with the underlying ideological differences and is typically in response to the needs of settled communities. Some of the issues that are resolved by these projects have been caused by a lack of attention to the integration of migrants in the past. The migrant issues before us today are not entirely new, and we need to learn from the mistakes that have been made before. I would hope, therefore, that as Near Neighbours starts to think about its next phase, it could helpfully expand to include an opportunity for engaging in dialogue within communities to help understand the causes of isolation and lack of social cohesion. Let's face it, we have 15,000 points of contact across the land in which that dialogue can take place. However, in order to achieve it, it will require significant additional investment. So far, the vast majority of the funding for Near Neighbours has come from Her Majesty's Government through DCLG. I believe that it may be necessary that if we put ourselves in a position of supporting action, we actually need to be prepared to put some C of E money up into the mix. And maybe that'll need us to reconsider the way in which we give support to external agencies and bodies through votes 3 and 4. Thank you.
Your Grace, we're on a 3-minute limit, and it would help if we could keep to that.
I'll do my best. I very much welcome this motion and particularly also welcome Giles Goddard's amendment. I think we need to recognise, though, that especially paragraph D of the motion essentially commits us to supporting the use of armed force overseas. The reality of working in those areas to create safe ways of routes to places of safety must include some kind of forceful response. It is almost impossible to see how it can be done otherwise. We are at the point where in the Houses of Parliament we will be compelled to think quite shortly about how we respond to a government proposal, I suspect, to extend the bombing campaign across into Syria. It seems to me that where the Church is talking about welcome, we must also listen carefully to the powerful words of Bishop Angelos and of his colleagues from that part of the world, that the ideal situation is not simply, as one of them put it to me, to create a drain for the people of those countries to escape, but also to create the means by which they can stay in prosperity, in flourishing, and in safety. The implications of that for the commitment of this country and the others in the coalition are absolutely enormous. What we have not seen at the moment is a sufficiently coherent response that brings together all the forms of action that are required if indeed we face what the Prime Minister has described as an existential crisis. Therefore, I support the motion, but I think we need to bear in mind the implications of us taking it on board. Not only must the Church be willing to put its own money where it's putting its mouth, not only must we be deeply committed to the welcome and to the private sponsorship of people coming in, but we must also recognize that in much of the Levant and the Middle East, and in many other parts of the world, including northeast Nigeria, including Burundi and other places, the forces that are driving people out into being refugees may need to be confronted. In the same way as the French police on that dreadful night so recently had to go into the Bataclan theatre and deal with those who had taken it over, the international community has to face the necessity that it may in certain parts of the world need to challenge the equivalent people who have not taken a theatre but taken a whole section of land and are using it to wreak the most terrible havoc and cruelty. Let us indeed support this motion, but let us do so utterly realistically about its implications.
I'm going to move to the amendment at item 14 and ask Very Reverend Andrew Nunn to propose the amendment standing in his name. You have up to 5 minutes, and I want you to speak to and propose the motion, the amendment.
Thank you. Andrew Nunn, Deans 55. I'm glad that we're having this debate today and was very pleased to see the motion that is before us. But to be honest, I was a little surprised to see that word welcome at the beginning of B to describe our response to what has been offered to our brothers and sisters who are refugees, teeming across European borders, living beside the Eurostar tracks in Calais, in the refugee camps in the Middle East. My memory might be wrong, but when the government announced that we would be taking 20,000 refugees over the course of this Parliament, the response, and in particular the response of the Church, was not one of huge welcome. There was a huge amount of disappointment instead, a sense of frustration, for some anger that a country which has such a good history of welcoming refugees, and as the Bishop of Durham said, hospitality is part of who we are, was only able to make such a meagre response. Of course, for those who will be brought from refugee camps to this country, it will be wonderful, and I'm delighted for them. But the government's policy is too little and could be more generous. I didn't welcome it then, and I find it hard to welcome it today. This synod is never very popular when we're perceived as trying to tell the government what to do. Well, I think that there's an honourable position for the Church to speak truth to power whenever that's needed, to hold the moral compass, to let the plumb line measure the rightness of our actions. But I take the point that if we pontificate on these matters, we should be seen to be helping achieve what we desire. And on this subject, as we've already heard, we are doing that. My own cathedral responded immediately to the developing crisis by sending money to the Anglican Church of St. Paul in Athens to help that congregation respond generously in their wonderful work with refugees who've arrived in that city. We visited the jungle camp in Calais along with our diocesan bishop to hear the stories and give support and provide Bibles in people's first languages for use in the wonderful Church of St. Michael that's been built in the camp. Parishes across the Diocese of Southwark have been making their own generous responses, as have our schools. Other dioceses, and I know in particular about the great work being done in Chelmsford Diocese, have made very generous responses. We can provide blankets and Bibles and money, and we can promise accommodation, but we cannot open the borders. I want the nation to be more generous. And if, as the Archbishop has just said to us, we do become militarily involved in Syria, even more refugees will be heading our way. Much more generous our response needs to be. So I acknowledge what the government has done, but I cannot yet welcome it, and I hope that Synod will similarly tone down that clause in the motion and not give a mixed message to the nation. I move the amendment in my name.
I call on the Bishop of Durham to respond.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Andrew, for raising this proposal. However, I will resist this amendment. The clause welcomes the scale of the aid provided by Her Majesty's government. They are to be commended for holding to 0.7% of overseas aid. They are to be commended for putting more aid than almost any other nation on earth into the situation in those camps. That cannot be just acknowledged, that must be welcomed. Secondly, we do call on, we recognise in the motion itself that we don't think the 20,000 is adequate. We do call for more, but we should at least welcome the 20,000 because that's a move, because originally it was zero. So we welcome the fact that there has been movement and we are encouraging further. And finally, I simply have to say that in practice, on the ground, those of us who are now doing it, working as positively as we can, where we can, with Richard Harrington and others involved, it is making progress. We need to be as welcoming as we possibly can, and therefore I would urge you to resist this amendment.
Now, we're simply debating the amendment, and I see no one standing. So, I'm going to put the amendment to the vote. Those in favour of the amendment at 14, please show. Those against? Well, the amendment is clearly lost. I'm going to now ask the Reverend Canon Giles Goddard to move his amendment at 15, please. He has up to 5 minutes again, and I would ask him to speak to and move his motion, his amendment.
Thank you for calling me Chair. Giles Goddard, Southwark 220. I'm submitting this amendment at the request of the Bishop of Croydon, Jonathan Clark, who's already been mentioned. He is chair of the Church's Refugee Network. It arises mainly out of the work that the Church's Refugee Network and others have done with refugees in Calais. I'm using the word refugees rather than migrants because I think it's a better word to use. The situation of those in Calais has dropped from the news recently. However, an article in The Guardian on the 3rd of November said that there are now 6,000 people living there in terrible conditions. One of the aid workers said it is the largest slum in Europe and probably the worst. An Iraqi nurse called Kazan, aged 35, is living at the heart of it in a wooden structure, half the size of a small garden shed, with his wife Shaman, his 1.5-year-old son Hem, and his brother-in-law. He said, "When I came here a month ago, there were 2 families. Now there are 40, 50, or 60. We've never lived like this before. We feel like we are dying slowly." This amendment makes explicit what is implicit in the main motion under section D. It makes particular reference to those with family already legally resident in the UK because, according to Citizens UK, around 10% of those in Calais would definitely qualify for right to remain in this country on the basis of family connections. But the processing of their applications is virtually non-existent. There are also European implications to this amendment. If the UK is seen to be fulfilling its responsibilities, it will help the discussions across Europe, which have been so difficult. The government has made a start, but we've heard today that much more is needed. It's not as if we don't have the resources or the space. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and I learnt recently that the built environment in this country covers only 4% of the UK's land mass. I think that's a surprising statistic, but apparently true, and it's even less if you include urban open spaces and brownfield sites. As we've heard already, there's no point in asking the government to do something unless we get our own house in order, and so I very much welcome the main motion. But the situation of those already in Europe, especially those in Calais, is worsening by the day. And as a country, we have obligations to refugees and migrants which we are failing to fulfill. I therefore propose the amendment and urge Synod to support it. Thank you.
Call on the Bishop to reply.
I'm very grateful to the Bishop of Croydon for the work that he's done behind the scenes, and then to Giles for proposing this. It does make more explicit something that is implied in Clause D, and I would accept the amendment.
We're on the amendment only. The Bishop of Dover, followed by 3-minute speech limit.
Dover 43. I welcome Giles' amendment and hope we will pass it, and I want to speak particularly from our experience in Canterbury, engaging with the Roman Catholic Diocese of Arras, which includes, of course, that area of Calais, which we now so wrongly call the jungle. The Guardian article in November the 3rd is in fact incorrect. At the minimum number of people currently surviving in the jungle is approaching 10,000 people. We discover in our engagement with those communities a total lack of infrastructure, a total lack of coordination, and in many ways the Christian community runs the risk of being part of the problem and not the solution. Those communities in our country who so gladly and willingly want to do something are doing less than well by taking stuff to Calais, by delivering stuff which nobody knows how to handle, which is causing many of those who are volunteers there to lose heart completely. I welcome Giles's motion because I want to say from the Diocese of Canterbury and from us and from CUF, we are intending to appoint a person who will work in Calais to coordinate and support the volunteers. We hope that person will be in post in the beginning of January, and we as a diocese, together with the Roman Catholic Diocese, with us and CUF, stand very willing to work with the government to ensure that that coordination identifies the needs of particular refugees in Calais, particularly those who have the right of asylum in this country. I hope, Synod, we will support this motion wholeheartedly.
Point of order, Mr. Freeman. It certainly would have my consent. Would it have the consent? We do that later. Mr. Oldham.
Gavin Oldham, Oxford 378. I welcome this amendment because it refers to refugees as opposed to migrants. The whole debate refers to migrants. And I do think we should appreciate, and I just want to speak in this context really, that the situation in migration in Europe is much more complicated than purely the refugee situation. And it's been caused that way because of the Eurozone. Because the common currency, which makes Germany operate at a much lower exchange rate than it should be, and the Mediterranean countries operate at a much higher exchange rate than they should be, has driven migration throughout Europe. And because people do not want to move generally to Germany from those Mediterranean countries, they've come to England, to the United Kingdom. And that's why we have nearly 500,000 French people living in London, why we have so many people from Poland and from Italy and from Spain. And so I think when we talk about doing things in proportion, you've got to look at migration as a whole. You can't simply look at the situation for refugees. You also need to look at the overall migration situation. So I just want to make that point. I will be supporting this amendment. I think it's a very good amendment because it refers to refugees. But don't think that migration is just about the refugee crisis. It's not. It's about the non-functionality of the Eurozone and the way it's driving migration throughout European countries. Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Freeman. Yes, that has my consent. Does it have the consent of Synod? Those show in favour, please. Those against? Clearly carried. So we vote now on item 15. This is the amendment at item 15. Those in favour, please show. Those against? Clearly carried. So we move now to the debate with item 9 having been amended by item 15, and we're back on the debate. Bishop of Gibraltar in Europe, please, followed by Dr. Tremi. Harrison.
Robert Innes, Europe 17. I first of all want to thank parishes and individuals in this country for their prayers and financial gifts made to our diocese and to our churches over recent months, which are hugely appreciated. We face a problem of immense scale and seriousness. EU leaders are talking about the biggest crisis to hit Europe since World War II. And at the political level, European leaders struggle to be coordinated and have not been able to offer solutions. The crisis requires immediate medium-term and long-term action. There's an immediate need for humanitarian assistance, but medium-term we need to establish safe routes of passage so migrants don't fall into the hands of the some 29,000 people working as traffickers in Europe. Long-term, we face challenges of economic justice, peacemaking, climate justice, so people can stay in their homelands. Many churches in my diocese are already working with migrants. They are supplying them with warm clothing. Perhaps more importantly, they provide some of the social and spiritual needs, human contact, helping with language, involving asylum seekers where appropriate in church and family activities, building bridges that help people feel valued and welcome. People in my churches have had themselves to struggle with living in cultures which are not their own, and so they know how to help others do that. We should warmly commend our government's international aid programs where we lead in Europe. But within Europe, the burden of migration is being felt very differently in different places. My hometown of Woking here, I understand, is offering 12 families, accommodation for 12 families. When I visited Leipzig, they'd received 5,000 families. In Milan, 70,000 migrants. In Greece, hundreds of thousands of migrants. The heaviest burden is being borne by the poorest EU member states. This is a moment when Europe has to work together, and I would encourage folk in this country to work in solidarity with our European partners to share together in facing this very serious crisis. I'd also encourage the Church of England to give theological resources to understanding the deep roots of this issue, which is multifaceted. And I would love to see better coordination amongst Christians and some deep theological reflection on the causes and nature of migration and how its terrible effects can be ameliorated, and to point signposts of hope and to see where God is speaking to us and what he is saying to us in this hour. Thank you.
Dr. Jamie Harrison, followed by Mr. Elliot Swatbridge.
Jamie Harrison, Durham 299, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm grateful for this motion, particularly as amended by Canon Giles Goddard. We are being explicit, and of course being explicit had its risks. The words in the amendment, fair, proportionate, the words in our main motion at B, over 20,000. This can start to worry people who don't share our own particular interest in the words of welcome, hospitality, equity and generosity. For to welcome is not merely to tolerate, it risks rejection. 3 weeks ago, or even less, our diocesan synod in Durham passed a motion calling for the government to establish a national welcome and resettlement board. 11 days ago, not 11 years for a diocesan synod motion to get here. Amazing. And here we are wanting to engage with the government in numbers, in being explicit, in wanting to see more people coming and to be truly welcomed. Yet to be truly welcoming, realistically, can be costly. It put pressures on us, but more worryingly perhaps, for those around us, it puts pressure on our healthcare system. As many of you know, I visit for the Care Quality Commission GP practices. Many are under pressure. Those in education, you know the pressures you have in primary and secondary education. Those in social systems and in housing know how easy it is for people to complain when others come in late in the day as they see it, to take what they believe is theirs. So one of our main challenges is to be able to articulate what it means to be hospitable, to welcome and to share. We've already heard something of the amount of money we have in this nation, so many resources which we should and can share. One particular challenge, as the website Medical Justice tells us, is that between 5 and 30% of those who come as asylum seekers have suffered torture, with its severe physical, mental, psychological and spiritual effects. We need to release the resources in our NHS, in our various systems of care, social care, psychological care, to allow these people to flourish, to have language engagement, to have translation services to explain their needs, to support them. So as I support and hope we'll all support very thoroughly this amended motion, I'm reminded of those 2 Jewish girls who came over, German Jewish girls on the kinder transport, who found themselves in Coventry when the bombs were dropping. Where was the family that they'd left behind to suffer under the bombs? Though they'd gone off to the countryside in their car to escape. No, we must not just tolerate or even seemingly reject, but we must welcome and do so with realism, because that is our calling as people who follow Jesus Christ.
Mr. Elliot Swatbridge, followed by Stephen Linus.
Elliot Swatbridge, 483 CUIC. We are all immigrants. Biologists argue that all human beings alive today have an ancestry that can be traced back to Africa. We are all thus ultimately related. It might be legitimately said we are all Africans. Humankind then migrated throughout the world. The first anatomically modern humans to reach Britain arrived around 40,000 years ago. We're thus also a nation of immigrants, each and every one of us. There is simply no such thing ultimately as a native Briton. I go online and I am staggered by the extremity of people's xenophobia, prejudice, and downright racism. To be frank, recently has made me deeply ashamed to call myself British. Let's not talk in solely abstract terms. These are real human beings. Asia Bibi from Pakistan is one of them. Though not Syrian, she too is a member of the 60 million displaced people which GS 2009 highlights. After a discussion in June 2009 about her faith, she was falsely accused of insulting the Islamic prophet Muhammad. She was arrested, imprisoned, and in November 2010 was sentenced to death. She was put in windowless solitary confinement in a 2.4 by 3 meters room and has been physically abused by prison guards. To quote reports, she's suffering from internal bleeding. She requires urgent medical treatment. She vomits blood, she suffers terrible pain, and she can hardly eat. Her family have gone into hiding, having received death threats because of her case, and if Asia is released, they will together be forced to seek asylum in Europe. I would be absolutely shocked if anyone with even an ounce of compassion would deny them. Yet, if they would for her, why are some so willing to deny this to those fleeing from Syria? Yes, they may not have their family formally arrested because of their faith, yet their lives are in similar jeopardy from fierce conflict. Lives are literally in our hands. In God's eyes, it is no good praying for our persecuted brethren if we, when it comes down to it, will withhold from them the very thing that will guarantee their safety and freedom. As a body of the people of the God who himself was a refugee to Egypt in the infant Jesus, we are called to welcome as many asylum seekers as possible, even if it involves deep self-sacrifice. In the end, the government's 20,000 figure is only 0.03% of our population. Please pray for Asia Bibi, but also change the lives of tens of thousands of people like her by challenging our culture's undercurrent of xenophobia and advocating for our nation to welcome far, far more than 20,000 and even more than 50,000 refugees. We are all immigrants, after all. God might well be calling us to be the answer to our own prayers. Thank you.
Stephen Linus, followed by Canon Debbie Flack.
Stephen Linus, Bath and Wells, number 60. I'm glad to be following Elliot because he mentioned that word xenophobia. It does seem to me that one of the aspects of this matter which is not addressed in our motion, and perhaps can't be, and not addressed in our conversation so far this morning, is the hostility to migrants and refugees, particularly as expressed in some sections of the press, which makes it quite difficult to talk about this issue in the way we might like. Exactly 43 years ago, as a rather spotty young ordinand, I spent this autumn period working as a volunteer in a resettlement camp set up by HM government for those who have been expelled from Uganda, the Asians, by President Idi Amin. And the resettlement centre was one of about 10 set up in army bases, air force camps, buildings of that sort. I was at RAF West Malling in Kent, which was near my home. And I went there out of my Christian commitment, and I went there because I needed to fill a gap here before I went to train for the ministry. Now, in those days, it was a Heath Conservative government that organised the airlifting of thousands of Ugandan Asian refugees to this country. Civil servants were seconded, government premises were made available. The response was very, very different to what we're seeing and hearing about in the press at the moment. Now, the situation is different, the nature of the crisis is different, but I learnt an awful lot of lessons, and I hope that stay with me through my ministry. But it does worry me that we do not address the hostility that is being put in all our media. I spent my time in a refugee camp writing a newsletter to help people get in contact with one another. I spent my time operating a telex machine, trying to help refugees who were in Kent be reunited with their grandparents who were in a refugee camp in Tonfinau on the western Welsh coast. It was heartbreaking at times, but I learned three things from that. I learnt to enjoy Asian food, which I'd never encountered before. I learnt something about the courage and dignity of refugees. And I learnt something about the gratitude of those refugees and their commitment to make a good life in this country from the rescue that they've been offered. And we all know now, 43 years later, of the immense contribution of Asians from Uganda to our business and community life right across the country. They were committed to make a go of it. So my plea today is that as we pass this motion, we remember also that we need to alter the narrative in our parishes and our communities. It's not just about us and the government. I hear it in my pub. I'm sorry to say I hear it in churches where I go to minister. People are afraid of refugees and migrants. We need to knock that on the head in all that we say and do.
Canon Flatt, followed by Dr. Meg Warner, to make a maiden speech.
Chair, thank you for calling me. Debbie Flack, Europe 113. I just want to speak a little bit about what's happening on the ground in my diocese. As we've heard, over 800,000 migrants have landed in my diocese by sea so far this year. That doesn't include the estimated 3,500 who have drowned or those who have entered undetected. Nor does it include numbers of refugees fleeing conflict within Europe, for example, from the Ukraine. There is that unprecedented pressure that we have heard about on European countries and upon the churches that are seeking to serve. Many of our countries and our diocese have, of course, been affected. So I'm just going to tell you about two places where things are happening. One, of course, is Lille, because I'm the vicar of Lille. And I would just like to mention to the Bishop of Dover that I don't think Monsignor Jaeger's territory includes the Archbishop of Lille's territory. So the churches and charities together in Lille work under the beautifully titled Conseil œcuménique de solidarité de doyenné de la ville de Lille. As you will notice immediately, they're not very good at snappy titles or acronyms. We were called to an emergency meeting at the end of September and learned that the main need of many of the charities in Lille was, please don't send us any more clothes. Please send us funds now and send us long-term volunteers. And I think you will find that applies to Calais as well. We were strongly encouraged not to do things on our own, but to join in on existing initiatives. One of those initiatives has in October, the Médecins du Monde and the Secours Catholique, who are the people most involved up in Calais, filed something called a référé liberté at the Administrative Tribunal of Lille to force the French government to take urgent measures about the situation of those migrants in Calais. The court ruled that the state had 48 hours to undertake an inventory of the unaccompanied minors in distress and to try and force the Pas-de-Calais département to invest. In Athens, as you have already heard, there is much going on, and they are working together with the churches in Athens, which is a new move as well. Every 2 days they put out a media update to let everyone know what is happening. And there is growing concern in Greece at the Balkan countries' actions to either close or restrict border crossings to migrants who are not from Syria, Afghanistan, or Iraq. And I support this motion. Thank you.
Dr. Meg Warner, followed by the Bishop of Southwark.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Meg Warner, London, 359. It will be obvious from just those few words that I'm a fairly recent migrant. I came to this country 2 years ago from Australia, and I was one of the lucky ones. I come from a nice colony, and I have a grandparent who was born here. There are many things that I will miss about my home country, but I confess that there was one guilty sense of relief that I found about leaving, which is that I was leaving behind the political situation in response to the challenge of refugees and migrants in my home country, which I could almost describe of a system of institutionalized cruelty designed to stop the boats and designed to stop migrants coming to Australia. There is a sense that that policy is succeeding because the boats have stopped. That is, of course, not success, because any success in stopping boats travelling to Australia can only result in a number of boats travelling to other countries less able and less resourced to support them than that country. While here, I have been seeking to build a ministry of travelling Bible scholarship similar to that pioneered by Dr. Paula Gooder. And what do you know, my first gig, with thanks to Bishop Trevor, was in the Diocese of Canterbury. And so I found myself in the sharp end of the issue here, and I found that many of the sentiments that I had experienced in Australia were those also that I was beginning to hear in this country too. But that opportunity gave me a chance to really think about our biblical tradition and what it is that our tradition has to say to us and speak to us about this issue. It's not always easy to look to the Bible for guidance, for ethics and for acting today. Our Bible speaks with many voices and not one, and it speaks from us to us from a context which is very different from our own. And that's one of the reasons why it is so remarkable that our tradition speaks so clearly in relation to the question of migrants. Our two primary foundation stories tell us that our people began as migrants. The Exodus is an extraordinary story of delivery from oppression in slavery, and leads to the reminder that we were slaves in Egypt and that we ought therefore to remember others. The ancestors of Genesis, Abraham was also an immigrant, and he was told, as were the members of his family, to live in the land which he would be given as an alien. Leviticus tells us that the Lord tells us that the land is mine, and that with him we are but aliens and tenants. It is for us to live as aliens and not to alienate others, and I commend this motion to the House.
Point of order, Ms. Freeman. Tempt me in 3 minutes, if you would. Bishop of Southwark, followed by Jonathan McNeely.
Chris Chesson, Southwark 39. I'm glad to support the motion before us, as amended helpfully by Canon Giles Goddard. The crisis which erupted suddenly, if the media is to be believed, was in fact many years in the making and will require a response lasting years and decades. The people of Syria are still at the mercy of the regime's barrel bombs, still forced to watch beheadings and crucifixions of family members and kinsfolk at the hands of ISIS, still forced to pay the extortionate jizya tax as humiliated minorities, still in increasing numbers experiencing the deadening existence in refugee camps. Bishop Angelos has spoken very movingly to us about what we are doing and all we can do together as the Church in England, and the Archbishop of Canterbury is right in reminding us that we need to help to make it possible for Christians to stay in their historic Middle East homelands. Her Majesty's government, which is to be commended for its financial commitment, second only to that of the United States, is nevertheless, as the motion recognizing, lagging behind many of our European partners, rather lamentably so, in opening our borders to those in very evident peril. There is, of course, the enormous diplomatic challenge to encourage other countries to meet their aid obligations. No amount of resettlement will mitigate the continued failure to address the refugee crisis at source. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has calculated that for what was needed in the way of humanitarian aid, the amount raised fell from 71% in 2013 to a mere 37% by October of this year. The consequences for the refugee camps in terms of food rations, education, health and other facilities will be drastic unless this trend is reversed significantly and rapidly. I will be visiting camps in Jordan during Epiphany Tide, along with Roman Catholic bishops from the Vatican Coordination Group, and Erbil with other Anglican bishops in March. The merit of this motion is that, firstly, it recognises the long-term nature of the migrant crisis, for which there are no easy fixes. Mass displacement and dispersion will present us with issues and challenges for years and decades to come. Secondly, in each of our dioceses, my own no exception, there is great eagerness to extend hospitality, as has been well attested in this debate, to provide shelter and safe lodging, to work in partnership with the government, local authorities and leading agencies. Thirdly and lastly, the Church has an important role in modelling a generosity of spirit that will have a compelling and converting effect on others. Thank you.
Reverend Jonathan McNeely, please.
McNeely, Chelmsford 084. Thank you, Chair, for calling me. Chair, at the start of last month, I had the opportunity to travel with a Hungarian charity to the Serbian-Croatian border to a town called Bapska, where approximately 5,000 refugees were crossing every day with local aid brought by a local group in Epping. My abiding memory will be of smiling children lining up waiting to get on buses to be taken to their next destination, and of their very relieved but exhausted looking parents. It was great sadness that a week after we returned, we understood that the razor wire had gone up, the rain had come down, and the refugees were now trudging through knee-deep mud, being told 20 miles in one direction or another they might find an open border. The organisation that arranged that trip was not a Christian one, but simply locally concerned people. They were excellently prepared, but the response was polarised. There was both support, but also, as Dr. Harrison has mentioned, much anger and fear. I think the Church must respond to both of these, challenging the fear and facilitating support. Challenging fear means in our pulpits, in our pubs, on social media, reciting that biblical imperative, do not be afraid. But it also means continuing our work here to challenge those issues in the social and economic realms that are causing people to be fearful and to scapegoat economic migrants and refugees. I think the Church is also uniquely placed to harness the goodwill of the nation. Where the Church was able to help in Epping was in engaging with local civic authorities with whom we have good relationships, in being able to provide access to local media, and in having a volunteer force by way of our congregations who were willing to give time and money and were easily exercised. Local churches, I believe, going forward, could act as sponsorship agreement holders on behalf of their communities within the private sponsorship route. And finally, I think that any credible, compassionate response has to acknowledge and recognise that there are costs and challenges to immigration. And it's imperative upon the Church that it should be at the forefront and willingly sacrificing, both in our financial and our social realms, and be seen to be leading in that respect. I commend the motion. Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Freeman. Yes, that has my consent. Does it have the consent of Synod? Those in favour, please show. Those against. Motion for closure is clearly carried. I call on the Bishop of Durham to reply to the debate. He has up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, everyone who has contributed. I will try and comment as speedily as I can. Caroline Spellman, thank you for all that you do for us as Second Estates Commissioner, and we look forward to working with you further. And thank you for all that you noted, not only about what government is doing, but also the local examples of the welcome boxes in Derby and in Knoll. Bishop Angelos, it is always a joy to hear you in this synod, and we are very grateful. And your point about collaboration is absolutely critical, and forgive us if we have not talked to you adequately. Thank you for your support for the motion, and your phrase about being light in darkness particularly struck me. Tim Hind, thank you for the point about near neighbours. I'm sure they may well be a key partner as well as offering learning from their experience. Archbishop Justin, thank you very much for your support. In reference to your comment about armed conflict, we would want to note that there may well be that for establishing safe and legal routes. I think those of us moving this motion would say that it is only in relation to that this motion gives support to armed conflict. But recognising that it is likely that some will be needed so to do. Bishop of Dover, thank you very much for your support for the Goddard Amendment and for all the work that you and others are doing, particularly in Calais. Gavin Oldham, thank you likewise for your support for that amendment. Whilst the heading is migrant, actually the entire motion is about refugees. And this is about refugees for humanitarian reasons. Robert Innes, Bishop of Europe, you are carrying a big load in Europe. Thank you for giving us some statistics to emphasise that. And the need for Europe-wide collaboration, and also calling for a theology on migration. Jamie Harrison, thank you for telling Synod about Durham's motion, which I have to say was put down before I knew I was going to be leading this. So it arose as a Deanery Synod motion that moved to Durham Synod. Elliot, thank you for your comments about all being immigrants and referring us to the plight of Asia Bibi, highlighting the fact that it's not just Syrians who suffer religious persecution. Stephen Linus, thank you for your comments about xenophobia and the need to alter the narrative. Absolutely. We do need to alter the narrative of fear. In my hometown of Bishop Auckland last weekend, a load of fly posters were put up, no refugees not welcome here. So it is something we have to do. And you also highlighted the point that we receive from refugees in your story about Ugandan Asians. And we need to constantly remind ourselves that this is a two-way process. We will learn and discover from those who come. Debbie Flack, thank you for further enhancing our understanding of what's going on in Europe, particularly from Lille and Athens. Meg Warner, thank you for your reflections on Australia and your comment about the fact that the boats haven't stopped travelling but are travelling elsewhere. And for beginning to respond to the Bishop of Europe about a theology about the clear biblical material on migration, particularly from Abraham and Exodus. Bishop Christopher from Southwark, thank you for your comments, particularly about emphasising the need for other countries to live up to their promises about aid into the region, and the need for us to model generosity of spirit. And Jonathan from Chelmsford, thank you for your final and your reference to your own visit to the Hungarian border, and also highlighting the need to challenge fear and to facilitate support with others. And thank you too for mentioning the private sponsorship possibilities, which is of course not actually mentioned in the motion, but are one of the practical ways that individuals, parishes and dioceses might well want to respond in due course. With all of that, and thanks to Giles Goddard again for his amendment, I commend the motion as amended, standing in my name.
Point of order?
Standing order 37.3, call for a vote of the full synod.
Well, given that I'm going to, exercising my discretion under Standing Order 37.2, to order a counted vote of the whole synod, because it seems to me to be important that we should have recorded figures. I'm not going to read out the words of the motion. You can see them on the screen if your eyes are good enough. This is a counted vote of the whole Synod. Those in favour should press 1. Those against should press 2. Those who wish to record an abstention should press 3.
The voting period is now open and ends after 1 minute. Fifteen seconds left for the voting period. The voting period is over.
They're voted on item 9 as amended by item 15. Those in favour, 333. Those against, 0. Recorded abstentions, 3. So the motion is clearly carried.